It's great to be here with you, Paul, for many reasons. One of the reasons we both went to Hunter College for graduate degrees. You in the MFA program, finished in 1994, and I did my MA in art history. I finished in 2006, so I'm like a decade later.
Wow.
But nonetheless, I think we have some fantastic, faculty members still active when I was there. So we are so also happy to partner with the Hunter College Department of Art and Art History this time. I think it's our first time actually creating, artist talk series together. So look forward to working further with the Hunter College. Where shall we start?
Well, we also both moved to New York in 1990, right? Or
Yes.
in the early 90s.
I moved from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I finished my university education, and I remember moving here in the summer of 1990. What about you? When did you arrive?
I also arrived in 1990. I want to say it was winter because I just remember the cold weather. But I was coming from San Francisco.
Yeah.
I went to the San Francisco Art Institute. So really, to me, the starting point is like, in so many ways, the current moment feels like both like a completion of a cycle and a return
Right.
to some of the aspects of like the politics of the 90s. And for example, at San Francisco Art Institute, I studied with Carlos Villa.
Mm-hmm.
And just in the past couple of years, Carlos Villa has become better known to a wider audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And artists like Charles Gain, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, soon, within a couple of years after we arrived, you started actually a Hunter MFA program. But
Right.
then, Whitney Biennial in 93 is a very important one.
Exactly.
And then there was also another exhibition, sort of like responding to what happening at the Whitney, the Theater of Refusal at the UC Irvine Fine Arts
Yeah,
Gallery.
we talked about this a little bit since I was hanging out in LA this past year, putting together the MoCA show. I was in dialogue with people and realized, Hauser and Wirth did a kind of 30-year revisiting of
Right.
this show. And what I understand is that Charles Gaines and Catherine Lord
Right.
and others at UC Irvine organized the show, not so much in response to the Whitney Biennial per se, but it was just in the air, a kind of questioning of the canon, ideas about who's excluded from the canon.
Right. And there are certain artists, I think, that are included in both exhibition.
Right.
I think such as Janine Antoni, I think was both exhibitions, and I think Byron Kim may have been included in both exhibitions as well. So also I remember, I was actually a law student in 93, but I remember I saw the show and I was, really surprised to see, Asian American artists included in that biennial. Bruce and Norman Yonemoto's their projected, sculpture piece was in that biennial, and Byron Kim was in the show certainly, and there's some, other fantastic artists like Gary Simmons. Who else? It was just, I was just a student back then, not knowing too much about the contemporary art, but it really can open up to see who can be exhibited in a Whitney Biennial. There are many artists of color, I think, injected in that collective practice of reconsidering, canons, who can be the subject of Whitney Museum's American Art Survey. So it was a very eye-opening.
I mean, I was also, coming to New York in 1990, I was living in the East Village and became a member of groups like ACT UP as well as Godzilla. And so it was an important moment. I was in the room when we met members of Godzilla, including Eugene Isai and others.
Was here.
Met with David Ross to address the imbalance, which led to Byron and others being included in that biennial. So it was a very kind of exciting time with a lot of questions and a lot of contention.
Yes.
I remember the press around that show being very divided about what the importance or what the meaning of the shift was at that time.
I remember Michael Kimmelman said, "I hate this biennial."
Who?
Michael Kimmelman
Yeah.
said that. I think there's a really divided opinions on a biennial, but I think it has one of the long-lasting impact, actually, as a biennial to the present day, and also space of activism, right? In respect to HIV, infections, and also the kind of small rise of, activism among the, gay Asian and Asian American, players as well, which we talked about too. So
Yeah, it was actually, there was a small group of members of ACT UP who formed a thing called the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition and was primarily concerned with, thinking through like how like Asian immigrant communities were not necessarily included in the bigger conversation. And there's just different dynamics.
And it was, soon after also, I remember the police brutality against Rodney King. It was 91, no? So...
Was it 91 or 93?
93.
Yeah, so it was really a watershed year.
Yeah.
And we're like 30-year anniversary
right.
of that whole moment. And I'll also say that my first participation in an exhibition in New York was at Art and General Gallery, a show that Ken Chu put together called Dismantling Indivisibility.
Right.
Asian American artists respond to the AIDS crisis. And what we're looking at now was a piece that I made in 1991, somehow thinking about the Catholic image as one that could have a wide enough familiarity that I attempted to appropriate it. And so the idea, I made a cape made out of silver condom packets.
Yes.
And I mean, this is like prehistory. I never show this, but in some ways it's funny because in some 30 years later, I've sort of come around to playing with Catholic icons again. Show that later.
Despite the fact that you grew up as a Protestant, correct? Right. So I know your mother.
My specific history in the Philippines is that, or growing up, I was born in Hawaii, but my parents were associated with the historic American University in the Philippines.
Silliman University.
Silliman University, founded in 1901. My grandparents were students and teachers there. My parents were, and I have been as well.
So let's just
Protestant university.
Yeah, maybe we can just kind of go back a little bit about actually your 2 years at Hunter College, right? How was your 2 years there?
Well, I came to New York to go to Hunter College. When I graduated from the San Francisco Art Institute, there were two schools that all the kids at that moment wanted to go to. One was the Dusseldorf Academy in Germany. The other one was Hunter College. And one of the things about Hunter College at the time was it was really like a school where working students went.
Yes.
Like everybody, in other words, people wanted to be there. And we occupied the Voorhees building behind Port Authority, and it was pretty much vacated. So the idea was if you were accepted into the program, you got a huge space, you just had to fix it up yourself.
I mean, even 10 years later, when I was a student in art history, we all go to open studios in that building. And we learned that, lots of students just sort of not living there, but they could spend the night there, working all night. And it was like a very different environment from, art historian, sort of confined in library and, other parts of Hunter. But I remember myself 10 years later learning from someone like Robert Morris. Mm-hmm. He was just reading, notes from his binders and talks about, video art and, sublimities. And he was just repeating the same lecture, over and over. But then you run into someone like Roy DeCarava on the hallway.
Yeah.
And having just a dialogue with Roy DeCarava.
Well, in fact, yeah, one of the great things about Hunter, probably the same way, is that you had access to the whole CUNY system. So, in fact, as an MFA student, I started taking classes that were primarily for PhD art history students at the Graduate Center.
Right.
And I also, I was really taking advantage, and I remember taking a class on African American art from Sherry DeCarava Turner,
Right.
Roy DeCarava's partner. Totally blew my mind.
Yeah. They really kind of, open up the kind of various channels for young, artists and historians to have access to entire CUNY system.
Yeah, I also, the air, the feeling at the time, the vibe was very politicized.
Yes.
I remember kind of making a proposal and doing a special project with Margot Machida as my advisor, a bibliography of Asian American art.
She was.
It was an excuse to go to literally every museum in New York and just go through their library and see what they had. I discovered randomly Alfonso Osorio in the Whitney Library. Never knew about him. Thought he was a Chicano artist and realized he was from Negros, from the same island that I come from in the Philippines.
So I guess, you take a classes and you have a crit and, you have to do some graduation project. And what did you do for your MFA thesis?
So I was splitting my time between participating in kind of group actions for ACT UP and for other like activist organizations at the time, Godzilla. I was a co-founder of a group called Kambasalusog, which was like a queer Filipino group.
Right.
I was also a member of Youth for Philippine Action, a kind of communist Filipino group. And I was literally using my studio to make props and floats for parades and actions while simultaneously doing the homework and just kind of cramming it all in. And I hit the mid-program review, which every MFA student goes through. And I remember I was producing a lot of my work at Kinko's at the time. It was literally pre-digital, so I was very attracted to just like color Xerox was like the most high-tech thing at the time. Yeah. And you could go to 8th Street or, to Astor Place, Kinko's, open 24 hours, and just like make tons of copies. So I was really experimenting with making color images on acetate, like on transparencies, and then piecing them together and playing with light. It was just, to me, it was like kind of the forefront of a kind of like evolution in image production towards kind of mass image making. And I was also playing with like gathering footage observationally from the street. Essentially, like I had this idea of using forms associated with religious festivals in the Philippines, things like Christmas lanterns and also religious forms like stained glass windows, using the shapes and the structures and literally filling the squares with photographs documenting the queer Filipino community or the queer Asian community, really just the queer multicultural community of the East Village. But like in a way, using the cultural forms and filling them with images, playing with light behind them, in a way just trying to use the kind of like the seduction of light and form as a kind of vessel to like sneak in these images that were erotic in nature. And I showed a project along these lines for the mid-program review, and I got totally failed. I was so surprised. I thought it was such an awesome project.
Yeah.
And I went to the head of the art department at the time, said like, what did I do wrong? This is like, this is what's happening in the street in New York. Like, I thought I was doing this in good faith. And they said, if you had made it out of steel or some more permanent material, then it would have passed. But you made it out of paper and bamboo. This is not art.
Well, I mean, I just try to remember who was the head of the art.
I'm not trying to.
I guess, but I remember him. He's being kind of formalist, right? I mean, sculptor. Very sort of like masculine. Kind of embracement of certain materials and structures.
I truly like. In retrospect, I just think, like you said, it wasn't Hunter College. Michael Kimmelman. Yes. Like, this was the debate of the moment. I literally remember, because I had to explain it to my family. Like, and I remember writing a letter to them and saying, please understand, this isn't just me. This is what's happening in New York.
Yeah.
Like, this debate is playing out, and I'm part of this debate.
And what was their response? I mean...
They trusted me.
Huh.
Yeah.
I mean, you come from kind of family of academics, right?
Academics and musicians.
Musicians.
Yeah, church musicians specifically.
Yeah. I mean, that would actually come up, to sort of like in your work and practice, certainly. I mean, sound seems to take an important role. I mean, one of the incredible things about your Los Angeles, MoCA exhibition was, sound was all over the exhibition. You walk through the various, structures of the, filmic works, sculpture work, then there's a sound, I think, in all parts, remember?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, it's a funny thing because in a way there's this two-part thing. I mean, to give you the fullest picture, both of my parents were involved in the 1960s and 70s in the movement in the U.S. and globally to record and document and conserve folk music. My dad was he was an ethnomusicologist.
Right.
And one of the things he did for the American University was he secured a major grant from the Ford Foundation that made it possible for not just him, but like a whole generation to conceive of a program to go into small communities around the Philippines with the premise of like inviting the community to perform. They would record the performances and then they would transcribe what they heard into sheet music and then made choral arrangements. It was a huge thing that was happening at the time.
Did you have a chance to, collaborate with your father, or any material he created was, the source material?
Well, yeah, the beginning of this process actually happened before I was born.
Yes.
But he eventually then went back to school at the University of Hawaii and was actually one of the first classes of students in ethnomusicology. He specifically did serious research on a particular group in southern Philippines called the Manobo, and eventually wrote in the early 70s one of the first textbooks on indigenous music in the Philippines. So while I was growing up, around age 3 to 10, every summer my dad would go and bring me and my brothers with him, deposit us in our grandmother's house in Dumaguete, and then go with a reel-to-reel recorder into Mindanao and make recordings of kulintang and of basically of the clans singing epic poetry. It's quite deep. I just this year went back to the Philippines and visited at the University of the Philippines the Jose Maceda Center for Ethnomusicology and discovered that they have close to 500 recordings of my dad's.
That's amazing.
And it's all digitized. I'm on the verge of getting the materials into my, I heard some of it on headphones while I was there. But I just want to say, his studio was right next to my bedroom, so at my grandmother's house. And so as a kid, he would come back, he would bring us all comics, and then I would hear through the walls him playing the strangest sounds, because it wasn't Western music structure. Completely strange to me. Actually kind of scared me a little bit, but also kind of haunted me. I just want to say that then, to me, there's in a way, well, the figure of Jose Maceda is actually quite important in Southeast Asia. This is a guy who is probably the most well-known ethnomusicologist in the Philippines and one of the most well-known in Southeast Asia. He actually went to school in Paris and studied studied avant-garde music, but then went back to the Philippines, and during the 70s, 80s, during the Marcos years, devised performances that were drawing on indigenous musical instruments, but then being done in very novel ways. For example, he did a famous performance that involved people playing throughout the archipelago simultaneously, and being broadcast on many different radio stations. So the idea was that at certain locations, radios would be tuned to all the different radio stations to create this group performance happening remotely.
Wow.
During a period in which, during the period of what do you call that? Martial law.
I see.
When all of the channels of mass media had been shut down by the Marcoses.
Wow.
So there's this amazing kind of confluence of sort of avant-gardist practice and ethnomusicological research happening, which is now sort of being rediscovered as something specific to Southeast Asia and to the Philippines, like a real hybrid between contemporary and sort of pre-modern.
It sounds like it's a perfect subject for exhibition, I mean, just to revisit that kind of collective, resistance, right?
It's already starting to happen. There's the curator, there's a couple, there's a Japanese musician actually, Aki Onda, who's has a practice now that he's touring globally. I haven't even seen these performances myself. Jose Maceda also did pieces that were pre-recorded on cassette tape and then played back on many different cassette tape players simultaneously. And Aki Onda has developed a practice where he's re-performing these Jose Maceda pieces.
Well, I think we should bring them to Asia to perform. I think that's
I'm plugging it because it's super exciting to me.
But then after Hunter, you got the Fulbright Hayes scholarship to return to Philippines. You were there for 2 years, and what happened? What did those 2 years do to you actually after sort of like a hot years in New York? Yes,
I mean it was a very important experience actually because. I mean, to be honest, having grown up moving between Hawaii and the Philippines, and I know this is confusing, but I also have family members that are have been who are part of Navajo Nation. So I actually one of my half brothers married into Navajo Nation, and I actually finished high school at a boarding school for Navajo kids in Farmington, New Mexico.
Oh, wow.
So I have this very nonlinear trajectory. And what I want to say, just this, that in a way, experiencing the multicultural 90s in New York was both very powerful in terms of kind of politicizing my perspective on culture, And at the same time, there was a way in which like it didn't quite make sense to me, because in a way the terms of the conversation, in some ways, I think were weighted towards, say, like Asian American kids who had never been to Asia, or who weren't so connected globally. That's not uniformly true. Like it was a very international mix, say like at Godzilla. But I think, you know, a lot of the kids that I knew at the time had like did not have strong connections to the Philippines, and so like in some ways it seemed to be, the conversation tended to be American centric, and my own experience was actually like very global. I was, so the Fulbright, you know, happened right after I graduated Hunter College, and you know, it was in 1994, so it was at the height of just after the 1993 biennial, and it just cemented for me, being in the Philippine context, how relative the conversation of New York was. The conversation in Manila was completely different. Yeah. And so it was, once again, like this shift where I had to contend with kind of switching codes, because if I spoke as though I was talking to people in New York, people would just be like, well, what are you talking about? So we're not really thinking about America, actually.
With that, you know, you returned to New York and you did a, you know, Whitney ISB. And what was like, Ron Clark was there? I mean, he was the director there, right?
Yes.
What was it like to go through 1 year program?
Super rich.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, just introduction to a whole other set of codes.
But that put you back in New York City, sort of like a culture politics again in late 70s, right? In a way.
In a way, but like, you know, in the Whitney program, I think the basis was, you know, very specific. Psychoanalysis, Marxism.
Yes, yes.
Formalism.
Yeah.
A kind of like, you know, an idea of a kind of ethical approach to, you know, playing with form. Essentially, like a kind of bias towards abstraction and conceptualism, and in a way the evacuation of figurative elements in favor of, you know, sort of abstract forms that would not create an illusion but reveal the substructure.
So, you know, with that kind of you know, shift in your thinking, but also kind of say embraced you perhaps at the Whitney program. And then within a couple of years, you know, you had a show at the, you know, MIT Lit Center. That's like a 2003 maybe, which I remember seeing. I mean, you know, you're well sort of like you know, embraced by certain curators by then, like Jane Farber, for example, or Holly Block. You know, it was people who came out of the independent actually gallery, you know, movement, you know,
Yeah.
earlier. So what was it like to go through those early 21st century showing and also experimenting? You know, I remember your work shown at the Lit Center, for example. Mm-hmm. Those kind of peeping, sort of like you know, big walls, and you look into it, right?
Right.
So what happened to you in your practice around that time?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like a lot crystallized
By then.
after, you know, at the tail end of this very intense period of like a few years of moving a lot to different contexts and exposure to a lot of different things. I just want to go back to a second to Hunter for a minute, because the real takeaway for me of what occurred there. So, you know, I made this thing, Christmas lanterns associated with like folk culture in the Philippines, kind of filled with homoerotic images, and I failed. and my advisors at the time, among them Juan Sanchez and Andrea Blum, who has an amazing
exhibition, yes,
survey of her work happening at the Hunter Galleries right now. Really cool faculty members. They took me aside and said, like, you have to understand, you know, there's a there's a program in place here. You can do whatever you want, but if you want to stay in the program, in a sense, you have to understand the codes that are being spoken and take them into consideration. And, you know, it seemed like it was less interesting to just kind of react to that. And in some ways where my mind went was like, how can I recode this so that it's accessible and legible to the faculty who are going to decide whether I pass or fail. And so I had this idea that rather than the Christmas lantern from the Philippines, I would instead make something more familiar, which was a stained glass window. Use the exact same homoerotic images. And the calculation that I made in my head is that the nature of the structure of a stained glass window is very much like the gridded structure of the paintings that the faculty were making. So I was like, okay, I'll use the grid. And it literally worked. Like, I got super high marks. So in a way, it was like really a formative experience.
Yeah.
I realized context is everything.
Yes.
Like, learn how to code switch.
The form can
And
vary. Yes.
you don't have to just speak essentially in one way associated with your biography. And in a sense, this has been kind of like the foundational realization for me about art making.
Maybe with that, actually, I should just kind of look at the pictures because you have a lot of slides to show
yeah.
today, right?
That's right. So in fact, you know, I'm going to try not to narrate too much, but these are, I tried to just find some of the earliest stuff. These are from the 90s. In this case, well, these are my first experiments with Photoshop. I was starting from ground plans of Renaissance cathedrals. This is Pavia Cathedral. The previous one is St. Peter's in Rome. And so I was looking at the pattern of the ground plan and reconstituting it using images that I was scanning from gay porno mags. And so what's happening is like a reversal of positive and negative space. The dark portions that are meant to represent the walls have been evacuated, have become like the evacuated space of the phallus. And so the edges of the walls are made up of mouths that are caressing the phallus.
It's very subtle. It's hard to tell. Yeah, very smart.
And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't so much like a sacred and profane thing. It was really thinking, following the cathedral windows that got me through under college, I became kind of obsessed with classical architecture. And as I started to delve into it, I started reading books on classical architecture, and I realized this is the code. Like, the classical architecture represents kind of the oldest continuing evolving like aesthetic code that goes right into modernity. So to use this found language instead of it's not my language. It's like to occupy this language would be a way to, to break into the common code.
Maybe actually with a similar, rationale, you also went to, stadium as architecture. That's another form.
I mean, literally, the stadium is one of the primary tropes in classical architecture. It's along with the basilica, it's probably the most clear representation of collectivity in classical architecture. Whoops.
I mean, that has appeared, in your works, over and over again, right?
I mean, in a way, there's this kind of double. In some ways, like the thought process for me is that, this isn't my language. I will adopt it and I will infiltrate it, and in a way do what I did from the beginning, like put a different like code switch it in order to scramble the code. Yeah, so the idea was like if these basilicas, according to the laws of the golden mean and the laws of proportion in classical architecture, represent a code that aligns all different levels of reality. The building is associated with the perfect proportions of a human body, and they're considered to be a kind of reinterpretation of a cosmic order that's found in nature. So in a way, you have nested the supposed divine proportion applied to the human body, to a building as a kind of body, to a city as another kind of body, to the state as a kind of governing structure.
Right.
Like in some ways, what you're dealing with in classical architecture is an idea of the choreography and alignment of experience on every level, from the microcosmic to the macro. It's an architectural code of power.
And then, architecture kind of force, people in it to behave a certain way.
It's the code of colonialism.
Yeah.
It's the code of state authority. So to mess with it is to, in a way, is like to inject yourself in the most profound way into the very heart of the matter. This is just like a random picture that a curator sent to me recently. 1998, me as a kid and Pasit Abad.
Oh, wow.
Doing a panel at the museum in San Francisco for a show called Home and Abroad, like one of the first like Filipino-American shows.
And of course, this is John.
This is actually,
Right?
so now jumping forward, I did the Whitney program in 97, graduated in 98. I was teaching at Parsons, teaching Photoshop at Parsons. And then on my off hours, I would go to the student lab and started playing with Premiere and video. And so this is the first piece I ever made in video.
Yes, yes. Is that Tom Cruise, right?
It's Tom Cruise from the movie Risky Business.
Right.
It's that famous scene where he, I don't know, to me, like, I tried so many ways to like make images. I painted when I was an undergrad. I was so awkward as a painter. And, but, when the first time I digitized a piece of footage, because it didn't start out digital. At that time, you actually had to get a VHS tape and then digitize it. But it, and I just was like scrubbing. And I was like, that's cool. Like, in a way, if you take a video out of its linear narrative format, in a sense, I thought it makes it like a painting. Like it's not going anywhere. It's, in a way, it's like a static image, even though it moves. It doesn't tell you how long you have to stand in front of it.
Right.
In that sense, it's like a painting. It's a random access thing that in a way, speaks to its own structure, the structure being the loop.
Did you get in trouble ever with a copyright holder of the film?
No, but, this was like literally, I showed this video for the graduation show of the Whitney program in 97, and then a couple months later, Jane Farver curated me into the Whitney Biennial.
Yes.
And I showed it.
Yes. Right. At the time, she was at the exhibition at the Queen's Museum.
Totally.
Yes.
All
right.
So just my second video.
Yes.
So the innovation here is that I'm learning digital video through Premiere. And one of the things that you could do in Premiere is convert a video image that's 30 frames per second into a film reel, which gives you 30 individual frames. And then you could take each of those frames into Photoshop and Photoshop it. So I removed like all of the identifying marks of the basketball court
Yeah.
in order to kind of focus more on just the kind of the bodily gesture occurring. Larry Johnson is just like, I just did a slam dunk. And so he's like celebrating, but by looping it to me, it becomes this kind of affectively ambiguous gesture. Like it could be celebration or it could be terror. And then there was actually one camera flash that happened in the background, and so I just multiplied it and turned it into many camera flashes. And the title of the piece is Fragment of a Crucifixion. I was thinking about Francis Bacon's paintings, the way in which like the figure starts to melt into the medium.
Yes.
And I was thinking, this is the digital version. Like what I saw happening in 2000 is the implication is with the digital revolution, we will melt into the digital. And we should scream.
It must be pretty labor-intensive practice, right? I mean,
it like literally hours. Yeah. In fact, I don't know if you can see it, but there's this kind of like subtle kind of artifact in the background that looks like wind. There was another figure there, and I was erasing the figure frame by frame, but then when it was playing back in real time, you could see the inconsistencies from frame to frame, and it appears as a kind of like disturbance, like water. And I remember being so unhappy about it. Like I kept going back trying to get rid of the wave to make it seamless, and I just couldn't do it. You couldn't do it working frame by frame like that. And it wasn't until later. I remember being just really like it was for a show, and I ended up putting it up, just feeling like, this is really embarrassing because it's not done.
How did you decide to show on a small monitor as opposed to larger
It was
projection?
just one of my classmates in the Whitney program, Kimberly Tomes, had this portable video projector, and I borrowed it from her. And it was just that's what was available. But I also like the idea of the kind of fetishism of making it very small, and the idea that, in a way it turns it into a sculpture. I mean, the other thing was that, in the 2000, in the Whitney Biennial in 2000, the majority of video work was shown in a rotating program in the theater. And at the time, the gallerist that I worked with, Christian Hay, and the project, sort of like said, I don't know, there was just this idea that if I told the curators of the Whitney Biennial, this has to play on this projector that comes out of the wall, then it could not be in the theater. It wouldn't fit in the theater.
Right.
And it totally worked.
Yes.
And I was one of two it was me and Doug Aitken, who were the only two video artists who were not in the theater.
I mean, you presented as a sort of like an object, right, in a way.
His was like a massive multi-channel video installation. Yeah. Mine was just like this simple, tiny thing.
Right.
It was actually the two videos, like bookends in a room. And I like the idea of these two images, one being Tom Cruise and the other one being Larry Johnson, being seen across from each other, and affecting your reading of them. And in some ways, like in retrospect, I think, it represents the pipeline between the stadium as a broadcast studio and the upper middle class living room entertainment center where Tom Cruise is flailing on the couch. And so between these two images, you have like the entire sort of video or broadcast infrastructure happening between these two images.
And you got the Box Bomb Award for this presentation, is that right?
Yeah, it was kind of a magic year because
it's the best work, from the biennial. Right? That's how
at that same time, Caroline Christoph Barkarzhev moved to New York and became a curator at PS1, and I was in residence at the World Trade Center at the time. And I remember she came to the World Trade Center and said, like, I just got off the plane and like I'm looking for artists for Greater New York. So like if you can like make a piece in the next couple of weeks, then like you're in. And so yeah, I don't think I have it here, but I made this piece, John 3:16. And so I had these two videos at the Whitney Biennial and John 3:16, another tiny video. And I, they sort of all happened very kind of luckily.
Right, very sort of in a condensed, period of time.
Yeah.
Happened, yes. Let's move to the next slides because mindful of time, we have another only
so I
20
just
minutes.
wanted to say that like what happened after these videos is I realized actually the watery waving movement in the background was actually super interesting.
Right.
And, my impulse to like perfect it was not as interesting as like what the material was naturally doing. So then I really emphasized it.
This is a long count, right? It's a Muhammad Ali in 3 different championships, I recall.
And at this point, I just want to say, like, in a way, more and more, I thought, following the success of my stained glass windows getting through the Whitney program, and the use of the grid, that in a way there's this kind of economy to using images that are super familiar. In a way, they're already speaking in whatever way they speak to a mass audience by virtue of their history or by virtue of their their recognizability in just like public media space, and that like classical architecture, to adopt a found language is potentially a much more economical and powerful way to speak.
So you move from basketball court to the boxing, matching ring, right? And what was the rationale? I mean, is that because the Muhammad Ali or popularity of the sport?
I mean, in this case, what was fascinating to me is that in an image like this, you have many things coinciding. On the one hand, there's this figure of Muhammad Ali, who's both like an entertainment figure, a sports figure, but also a political figure. And this is the footage is the final knockout round of the Rumble in the Jungle, which was a fight between him and George Foreman in Kinshasa a year in 1976, I think.
Right, over 10 years, I think.
From 60s or maybe 84, actually.
Yeah.
And this came as like an HBO special package of VHS tapes, the 3 most famous fights of Muhammad Ali.
I see.
And so I turned it into a triptych. In each case, it was the final knockout round, the Thrilla in Manila, the Rumble in the Jungle, and one of the early fights against Sonny Liston. And it was sort of like, he relieved, I like the economy of making as few decisions as possible. Like in a way, the more found it is, the more it already carries its own logic. And at the same time, each of these fights represents a kind of milestone in media history. The Rumble in the Jungle was one of the first global broadcasts of any event. And so it's a piece of media history. But then, there's, I could get into it, but there's also a play on foreground and background, or figure and context, which in some ways to me like relates to the notion of using a found language. like in a way, the found language is like infrastructure. It's like a thing that's running in the background already.
I mean, you kind of shift the focus back to the spectators, right? I think now we are more curious about actually how people respond to the match.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing how much you could see them, through this work.
I mean, I will say also just, because of like the trajectory you're describing, there's a way in which like the subject of identity gets scrambled if you start to consider the way in which like notions of individual agency or individual particularity are bound to relationships with the collective. And so, in a way, to play with foreground and background in this way, to me, conjures the actual ambiguity, like linguistically, experientially, of like coming into a sense of one's identity. In a way, to do that is impossible without simultaneously activating a relationship to existing codes that constitute a kind of infrastructure, a kind of armature without which individuality means nothing. So in a way that just, actually becomes more and more profound to me every day in the, now that we're dealing with social media and now the algorithm and AI, the notions of what constitutes individual subjecthood are so intrinsically blurring with the infrastructure of communication, let's say.
I think it's fair to say this work may be kind of precursor to your later work, like a Saint, right?
Definitely.
I mean, that's a 17-channel piece, and you now you hired actually those spectators, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a slides for Saint?
I don't.
Okay.
And I'll just show this really quickly because it has sound. It's another of the works from the triptych. This is The Thrill in Manila. So the last one was footage shot in the 80s in Kinshasa, Zaire. This is, I believe, 1976, during the Marcos years in Manila. Before this fight, Marcos went into the ring and made a special appearance, taking advantage of the media at the time. So like at this time, I got this random email with some, I forget even what it was because I can't remember how I would have gotten access to it. Maybe somebody sent me like a VHS tape or something in the mail, but I got a file from someone, a digital file, and I listened to it, and it was a sound file that sounded like this, and there was no explanation. I eventually found out it was an artist in California named Chris Kubik, who had seen my work and was inspired by it and did a similar thing sonically. He took interviews with Muhammad Ali and removed the words. So what you're hearing are just the kind of like vocal sounds before and after words. So yeah.
And yeah, of course. I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about Saints. Maybe I think it's. I mean, that's a Art Angel project actually you produced in 2007, and
yeah. Following the Whitney Biennial, I got an invitation from Art Angel to, who are like the Public Art Fund in the UK.
Yes.
And it was a very fantastic open invitation to come to London, to explore London as a city, and with the idea of brainstorming a possible project that would be sited within the architecture of London or the surrounding area. like not in a gallery or a museum, like specifically an intervention of some kind into the kind of the architectural space of the city.
And in that case, you chose 1966 World Cup, right,
Yeah.
between England and Germany.
Yep.
And
Yeah, it was just while I was over there, I mean, so I started going to London in around 2002, and I couldn't figure it out. I was exploring for like a number of years, and they were very patiently saying like, just keep exploring until something clicks for you. And then around 2006, I realized that they had decided to knock down Wembley Stadium in order to build a bigger version with like updated technology. And then, yeah, so I was just interested in the fact that it was a site that was undergoing renovation. And then came to realize that Wembley Stadium was built as part of the World Fair that took place in the late 1800s,
right.
and was the sort of centerpiece of a whole plan which was meant to introduce British citizens to the colonial territories that had been amassed by the British Empire. And at the center of it, the crowning glory of this campus of buildings that were representing industry and the kind of like ethnic whole territories around the world that were under the British authority. It was a stadium, and what would take place in the stadium were a combination of entertainment events like sporting matches, but also religious events.
Right.
And in fact, at the beginning of every football game, they would sing the song Jerusalem, which was a song that in the 1800s was, had been considered as a national anthem. It was based on a poem by William Blake.
Yeah. Huh.
And it describes an amazing imagined biblical scene of Jesus in his travels coming to like industrial era, Victorian era England, and the promise of England, realizing itself as this kind of promised land. So the layering of religious, nationalist, entertainment, sports, narratives
Within the structure, stadium structure.
within the stadium structure,
Yeah.
within the event, the notion of the stadium as a space of mass ritual, which carries multiple valences, turns it into a kind of matrix.
That's how you chose that space, and then you chose the 1966 actually.
And then I realized,
World Cups.
what every citizen of England knows, the 66 World Cup is like a sacred text, because the English invented the game of football, and the 1960s World Cup, 66 World Cup, is the only time they ever won it. They've never won it
They
before
beat
or
Germany,
since.
yes.
Yeah, and it was just one generation after World War
Right.
II. It was played against West Germany, and literally, so amazingly, Art Angel found on auction a mono sound recording
Right.
that was taken on the field during the 1966 World Cup that just exists in the archive. No sports commentary over it, just the sound of the crowd. It's such an amazing piece of audio. And in it, you hear the chants include, religious anthems such as like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which was the anthem of the English soccer team, the English national football team, but other religious hymns as well. And then you hear the the German fans chanting in German, you hear the English fans chanting in English, and you hear the English fans chanting things like, "We won the war, we won the war." So like so much history is wrapped up in this simple football game. And the lore,
Yes.
I was like, I'm not even a football fan.
Right.
Like I was approaching it anthropologically. There's a whole thing about the Russian linesman. There was a referee who arguably gave the winning point to the English, and some people believe he did that as an act of historical revenge against the Germans. So they're in a way, like it's such an amazing historical text that seems very simple on the surface, and also the sound of the crowd, is both historically specific in terms of every single thing that you hear relating to a kind of ritual aspect to do with English culture and German culture and football culture. And at the same time,
Right.
There's something just immediately kind of graspable about the sound of a crowd, and unstable. What that crowd is could be anything, depending on what your experience of crowds is. It could be frightening. It could be like attractive.
So then you basically you want to kind of recreate that sound and also scene. So you
Yeah.
hired hundreds of actually
Yeah.
actors, right?
I had this idea. So this is a national text. It's like one of the most sacred national text of England is this sound of the crowd at the 1966 World Cup. And in a way, I had this idea of, once again, just like occupying and scrambling it
Right.
by reinterpreting it through the voices of a hired crowd of Filipino non-actors. So I got their permission, and they gave me a budget. And I went to Manila, and with friends' help, I assembled a group of 1,000 men in an IMAX movie theater in one of the biggest shopping malls in Manila, and worked with a group of like theater trainers to break the audio recording down into its constituent parts. We analyzed the sound recording and picked out about 20 distinct chants and another 20 distinct songs in both English and German, and then basically performed them with this group of 1,000 men after feeding them Red Bull.
Did your mother take any role at all? Because she was a music teacher, right? Did any family sort of like?
Well, I literally, the cool thing about
Yeah.
the Philippines is that the creative community there is very tight,
Right.
and to be like an artist or a filmmaker in the Philippines means that you have a ton of day jobs, and you work in advertising, you work in like commercial film. That's how things get done. So in fact, friends of mine were able to there's an amazing history of kind of activist theater in the Philippines, and it's represented by groups like there's a group called the Philippine Educational Theater Association. These were people who were doing street theater, or who were going into prisons during the Marcos years and doing subversive actions with political detainees, just to in a way create a kind of camaraderie when things were very bleak. And simultaneously, these were people who were occupying official positions in the government under the Marcoses, running the cultural programs, and also involved with commercial film until commercial film was shut down during martial law. And I happen to have friends. And so they literally knew how to assemble a crowd.
I see.
For political actions. And they applied that to my scenario.
Because I'm just
And just to
mindful-
say that,
yeah.
in a way, like what was significant to me, like Art Angel thought that I should take this production to India.
Right. Yes.
Because that would be historically more relevant.
Yeah.
And I insisted on Manila partially because I, knew that I could do it there with my networks, but also because of the lack of a historical connection and the idea that by choosing the totally left field context of the Philippines to reproduce these sounds would both like literally encode a Filipino accent that would make absolutely no sense unless you think of it in terms of like the pattern of global outsourced labor. So in a way, these kind of resonances of contemporary labor as well as like historical connection and historical non-connection as a kind of strategy to subvert the logic of a nationalist text is just further ideas around code switching.
And how did you end up producing 17-channel, work? I'm out of this, right? Is that something you planned from the beginning? Or?
The idea was since we were starting from a mono single mic recording, the thing that you couldn't hear is the way in which sound travels in waves around a fan base of like 100,000 people in a stadium. And you see it in, if you actually go to football games, there's like the wave.
Right.
The wave is both physical, people standing up and sitting down to create a wave visually, but it's also sonic. Like, the sound will always start with a small group and then infectiously grow until it fills the whole stadium and then sort of fade away again. And it's like listening to the ocean. It's totally mesmerizing to hear the kind of, it's like, what do you call that? Like collective intelligence. It's like listening to insects or like witnessing how fireflies like sync with each other. It's a kind of form of emergence where people are kind of like through sensory channels coming into a kind of alignment. There's like more I would, I could say if there was more time about how that leads to, like back to classical architecture, how the kind of orchestration of the sensorium can be thought of as like a very powerful way of kind of constructing a sense of reality, a sense of identity on a non-verbal level. So to play with these tools visually, sonically, is almost like a key into a kind of affective, emotional register of the alignment and potential disalignment of power structures.
Here, you're looking at sort of like a selection of archival images you choose. And again, you raised all the references, right, to a specific player and also game.
Yeah, what's happening in almost every one of these pictures is that these are images from the NBA archive.
Right.
Every image is shot to feature a player, but within the shot, there's always like other players in the background who are in a defensive position. Usually, the money shot captures the central player in a what do you call that? Offensive gesture. So what's happening here is like I'm taking the offensive gesture out and moving the defensive gesture into the position of the protagonist, which is a kind of visual contradiction. Because, the defensive player is not meant to be the star. So very often his face is turned away from the camera and he appears to be falling back because he's being hit by the force of the actual protagonist.
You're kind of presenting these works actually in almost like life-size prints.
They're printed at a monumental scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have like a 15 minutes, so we should. But this is actually, great work, certainly. And also
Right.
this work actually being shown at the Tate Britain right now.
Yeah.
Surrounded by a group of actually Turner paintings.
Yeah. This was a video that was made in 2003. And it was made using footage that was shot in Cape Cod, sunrise over the ocean, the Atlantic, and then a sunset over the other side of Cape Cod, which also appears on the water because of the distance of the Cape from the mainland. So it's two ocean suns, one setting and one rising. And I don't know if I can describe it, but like basically they're like I cut the two images at the horizon line and then turned one upside down so that the two horizon lines become a line, and you're seeing the line descend from the top.
And you gave a title, Morning After
the Deluge. Yeah, which was
making a reference to a specific painting by
William Turner. Yeah.
Was that something that you planned that way, or it happened to be, you thought, relates to that particular painting? How do you go about this?
In a way, there's a certain productivity for me that I learned at the Whitney program around theory, like reading critical theory or art history, in that, in some ways, to like read written descriptions of, the evolution of, say, of technologies of perception, or ideas around visuality, in some ways can be like an inspiration for a kind of an interpretation of the verbal into like nonverbal form. And to make a long story short, I happened to be reading Techniques of the Observer, Jonathan
Crary, yes.
And he's describing how during the Industrial Revolution, there's this dynamic occurring of a kind of democratization of relations of looking, in the sense that you go from a kind of general idea of society being governed by the all-seeing eye of God, which is vertical, looking down, to kind of new forms of like democratic social relations in which that all-seeing eye of God is turned 90 degrees to a horizontal position and turned into a legal system in which the all-seeing eye is no longer religious but legal. And in some ways, people are now judged through the legal system as being either innocent or guilty, depending on, in a way, new democratic notions of the social contract and whether individual citizens or non-citizens live up to their obligations to align with the social contract.
And advent of photography also definitely,
And in fact, the court of law is known as the camera.
Yes.
So in a way, these changing relations of looking and the association with law are all being codified. So in a sense, like the thought for me is that in the digital age, another revolution is occurring of the optical and of kind of perception. And to make a long story short, like what you're seeing here is in a sense the eclipse of the earth, or the eclipse of the ground that as a viewer you would be standing on in inherited notions of one-point perspective. Like the horizon has literally been upended and turned into a moving line, and there is no ground to stand on now. And you're seeing literally the easternmost and westernmost edges of the earth, meaning the earth is been erased from this picture. It's kind of an impossible perspective. And so eventually the line, it's a 20-minute video, and at this point the line is, you're seeing upside down the sun setting into the water, upside down, and as it does, the sunrise occurs on the other side, coming up over the eastern horizon of Cape Cod.
I want to give people also to ask a question, so maybe we can talk one more project,
Yeah.
and then we can open that up. How's that?
I'm gonna, just rush through this. These are production images of a piece called Vitruvian Figure.
Yeah.
Another reference to classical architecture, and it's it was a commission for the Sydney Biennial in 2007, a collaboration with a design studio in Sydney that built the Olympic Stadium, 100,000 seat stadium, in 2001. And I worked with them to take the original designs for the stadium and expand it into a 1 million seat stadium, and then took the ground plans to the Philippines. And a big collective effort. Over 3 months, we turned it into an actual physical model. So this is a view of the viewing platform with a ramp that you go up to see it. And that's looking into it.
This piece was in Los Mocha show, and is that traveling to other venues, Bilbao?
No, yeah, the way it was made, because it was going to be imported, it was built in Manila to be imported to Australia. Just the way it was built, it ends up being so cumbersome that it's too expensive to ship it. It was kind of a miracle that Clara Kim and LA Mocha agreed to bring it to LA. But unfortunately, it's not in Bilbao, and it's not going to be in Chicago. I have ideas of making a new one that's more purpose-built to be much more portable. More about that later. I'm going to skip through this just so we can get to Q&A.
Yeah. And also, we want to hear what you're working on now as well, if you can tell us. Yes.
Just to show you, 20 years later, I'm returning back to the boxing videos. This is all footage from YouTube. And in a sense, it's like, it's like documenting the evolution in video technology in the sense that this high-resolution footage, only getting more lush and more high resolution every day, is totally available for free on YouTube. And similarly, the process is still basically frame by frame animation, but the digital tools to do such things are becoming more and more sophisticated. The reality of it is that, this is not AI. These are all still being produced by what's now my kind of like crew of rotoscopers and compositors in Manila, who I've been working with for 15 years now. And just to show you, at the beginning, I had an idea of taking old-fashioned CRT monitors and putting them through a process of electroplating, which turns the skin of the shell into an image, like a mirror. And more recently, I sort of have shifted to using transparent monitors. These are monitors that are produced for prison use.
I see.
They're transparent in order to prevent inmates from putting stuff inside the case. And you can only get them, basically how I get them is through eBay. Each one I buy comes inscribed with a number and a name associated with their use in a prison cell.
It kind of goes back to the idea of surveillance, right? Panopticon, right? Prisoners are being watched, and it's interesting to choose that particular transparent television. But then here's Justin Bieber.
Yeah, this is something that I've been working on for the past 5 years. It's
Right.
again sort of inspired by the idea that like within material practices, you have the historic DNA of a whole set of relations. So I started with one collaboration in the Philippines with a workshop that makes religious icons, Catholic religious images of Jesus or the saints. And in 2016, Justin Bieber was in the middle of the Purpose Tour, and towards the end of the tour, had a kind of mental breakdown, and after disappearing from public for a few months, reappeared as a born-again Christian, and at that point started covering his whole body with religious tattoos, starting with the words "Son of God" across his chest, and began appearing in concerts and evangelizing, and was specifically associated with Hillsong Church, a mega church based in New York, and originally from Australia, but based in New York and LA. A church mostly known, it's gone through upheavals, but it's specific in that it was, I think, like really the first church to be formatted to draw a congregation of many celebrities and sports figures. So the collaboration is basically I'm asking the image making studio, and this is a studio working in a tradition that goes back 400 or 500 years. Originally in Seville, Spain. That's really from medieval times been the center of sculptural image making in the ecclesiastical or like religious tradition.
Did those traditional artisans, did they show any resistance to, Justin Bieber being a subject? And because they really tapped into traditional artisan network, right, for this.
It's really it's a kind of, I mean, it's a fascinating wormhole to go down.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, I specifically, this figure is made by the top image maker in the Philippines, a guy named Willie Layog. And he's pretty unique in the Philippines in that he actually made a decision as a young man to go to Spain and apprentice under image makers in Seville. And so in a way, he is the closest to this kind of like tradition that comes from Seville of a hyper-realistic type of image making. One of the most famous Seville images of the dead Christ was here as part of the Like Life show at the Met a few years ago.
Sure.
There's two provinces of the Philippines, Pampanga and Laguna, that have been the center of this kind of image making for 400 years. And Willie Layog from Pampanga, the most senior carver from Laguna is a guy named Luis Ak, and this one is by Luis Ak. What I did from there is I traced and found Willie Layog's mentor, a guy named Jose Antonio Navarro Arteaga in Seville. So this one is made by Jose Antonio Navarro Arteaga. And the way I'm thinking about it is that it's tracing a historical trajectory referred to as the Acapulco trade between Seville and Manila through Acapulco. The galleons would go from Seville to the eastern coast of Mexico, and then goods would go overland to Acapulco, and Acapulco was the primary port, which then went to the Philippines, first discovered by Magellan during his first circumnavigation of the world in 1521. He stops in the Philippines in 1521. And one of the things that happens, this is by a woodcarver in Mexico, whose name is Ricardo Molina. Yeah, so Magellan stops in the Philippines in 1521. As a gift, he gives to one of the local chiefs an image of the child Jesus as a king, the Santo Niño. That image is referred to as the Santo Niño de Cebu. It exists to this day in the Basilica de Santo Niño de Cebu, in the city of Cebu in southern Philippines. And every January, there's an event called the Sinulog, where literally millions of devotees of this image of the baby Jesus as a king flock to Cebu to pay homage. And so really what I was thinking in 2016 when I started this project is that, in a sense, Justin Bieber as one of the first in YouTube discovered child stars, now grown up, but began as a child phenomenon, that he is the 21st century embodiment of the Santo Niño.
So now, what are you working on, if I may just ask you? You're still working on this body of work?
Yeah,
in a way, yeah.
Well, the show is going. I'm involved with a couple of projects. One is a collaboration with a football player named Edgar Davids for a show that's being conceived for next year as part of the Manchester Festival. 11 artists and 11 football players in a series of collaborations that will become a kind of immersive exhibition, which will premiere as part of the Manchester Festival in July next year, and then we'll travel to North America in time for the next FIFA World Cup. And I think I can announce I've confirmed that I'm doing a public commission piece for Barclay Center. Yeah. The idea is to create a replica of the Jumbotron that hangs above the court, but it'll be in the plaza outside. And it'll be a functional Jumbotron. So sometimes it will show the same content that's playing inside, so that if you can't get in to see the game, you can watch it in the plaza. And at other times, the entire Jumbotron will become a kind of light sculpture that casts monochromatic light fields that are timed to sync with the cycle of advertisements that are playing in the Oculus. But most exciting for me, along with it, I'm intending to run a 2-year media workshop, collaborating with community-based organizations in Brooklyn, a kind of study group for 10 selected participants, in which we will study Barclay Center as a living organism and look at all the systems that make it work.
If we may, maybe we can open up and maybe ask, maybe take 1 or 2 questions. Is anyone, we have actually a reception afterwards, so we could all go downstairs and have a drink with Paul. But if anything you have, burning question, please raise your hand. Yes. Yeah.
Hello. I'm not sure if this is on, but you probably can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Really wonderful to hear you speak, Paul, about your work. I was just noticing that something common that ran through the body of work was, the best word I can come up with is devotion. Devotion to a craft, how it works technically, how it transforms and is archived and shows up in, as a technology in the image. Individual devotions, collective devotion, how history sort of, whether it's like sports or religious kind of ceremonies and rituals, there's some fascination with this, and I was wondering if there was, if you had any reflection about that from a personal place, if you can connect it to something, maybe culturally specific or spiritually specific to back home or here, because it's very notable.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, I would say, yeah, like, I mean, there's so many ways I'd love to answer that, but I think the most resonant to me, obviously, is like, we're days away from an election, and I would say, the interesting thing is that for me is in the 90s in the Whitney program, they're like part of the critical tradition was a notion of the separation of church and state, or of a kind of agnostic, not, in a way, belief is a dirty word. It's associated with manipulation. In a sense, the crowd is also a dirty word. It in a way is the thing that we need criticism as an antidote for the kind of technologies of like influence and manipulation that we face in the 21st century, and even more so in the 21st century, in the 20th century, even more so in the 21st century. In some ways, this kind of critical structure and kind of ethical separation has clearly collapsed. So in some ways, I would say, in a way, the sensorium becomes the actual site, the medium of image making and of, in a way, world making, in a way that's both, kind of inspiring if you're an image maker, but extremely disturbing. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, to me, the play on belief systems couldn't be more primary in society today.
So actually, well, sure, one more question, and then let's go downstairs to have a drink. Yes, Anthony.
Hi. So architecture, you spoke very brilliantly about how architecture is so important in the work. And those crowds that you use are all contained in architecture. And I was wondering how would you ever use, or would you ever want to look at mass rituals that are not contained by architecture, such as religious processions, for example, that sort of move through space? Mass events that occur in some areas in Europe, for example, with bulls that are released in the city or things like that, or mobs or riots that are also very disturbing political events that sort of are uncontainable and uncontained. And yeah. I wonder how that works in your...
Totally. Well, I mean, so yeah, this past year I have actually been attending bullfights in Spain, particularly in Bilbao, because, I'm trying to use my institutional connections while I have them at the Guggenheim to get access. And that's definitely brewing. But you know, I mean, once I started working with Jose Antonio Navarro Arteaga in Seville, it became, you know, I'm just apparent how much these traditions are not just of the past, but are like completely active today. The reality is that in some sense, these religious images are power figures. They're very often commissioned by politicians and deployed in religious festivals in towns. And politicians in the Philippines that can afford it actually commission their religious images in Seville and import them to the Philippines. And conversely, Willie Layog has plans to open a studio in Malaga, close to Seville. In other words, there's a global clientele, and you know, the Contemporary Arts Center in Seville is a pretty amazing place. It's built in a historic monastery that at some point the monastery became a kind of ceramics production space as well, and now it serves as an amazing historically resonant space that shows contemporary art. And in fact, in 2026, I'm in discussions about doing a project there that may happen during Holy Week. The idea being to actually intervene into the hermandades, like the brotherhoods of the religious orders of Seville. They all kind of like reach their most intense moment during Holy Week in a series of processions in which all the religious images in a once-a-year ritual leave the churches that they usually live in and are carried on these like elaborate platforms through the streets. And so I don't know how exactly it's going to play out, but they are trying to. I'm talking with them about possibly showing these Justin Bieber images in a procession form.
So I guess with that, there's a really fantastic book, which came out, with the Los Angeles show. Clara Kim edited it, and great interviews, with Kenji Shannon,
Yes,
and Julie Merichu, and Lawrence Chor, and really great registries of the writings about your work. And it's a great book. We carry actually like 15 copies of this with your autograph, right, at the shop downstairs. So I want you to go downstairs. We'll have a drink and have a conversation with him. And if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, please do so at the bookshop. So I want to thank Paul for coming here and sharing your thoughts and works.